high emotions and these high lows and high highs and low lows and high lows and all everything in between that goes with the emotional roller coaster of being a mixed martial arts fighter. And then he comes back and beats Connor twice. That's the name of the game. I got to tell you guys, that was probably one of the greatest combat sports weekends of all time. Now, why do I say that? Well, first of all, you got to understand that some classics you will never get back. I'll give you an example. Right now, today, as you're seeing me in another car ride video, right? I'm in a different car. I'm in a 2016 as opposed to a 22 that you usually saw me in. And what's significant about that is the difference between the 22 and this 2016 car is that this 2016 car actually has a CD player. And the newer cars, maybe somewhere in the 2020s, 21s, and the one that I have, the 22, guess what? You don't have a CD player anymore, right? You remember back in the days when you used to think about buying a CD or buying an album that everybody promoted in the industry, like, oh man, All Eyes on Me is about to come out. Notorious B.I.G. Ready to Die is about to come out. Jay-Z's Blueprint 1 and 2 and 3 and volume whatever, The Life of Sean Carter, volume this and that is about to come out, right? There's this great anticipation. Korn, Limp Bizkit, what type of era had CDs? Let's say Everlast, and then Sublime. All these great music in the 1990s. Whitney Houston, just to name a few. They all required CDs if you wanted to listen to them, and then the iPod era came, and then that was that. So why that's significant is because you got to understand a classic only comes once in a lifetime, and maybe even just never again within that once in a lifetime frame that I just mentioned. So are we ever going to have CD players um in our cars in the modern day, especially with the new electronic cars and especially with the new cars that they're coming out with Bluetooth attachments where your iPhone is literally the absolute everything and end all be all of everything that you do, whether it's apps that you watch, ESPN, UFC, sports, soccer, basketball, or watching YouTube, which is the more common thing that a lot of people use as a media outlet or a media consumption in today's market. But nonetheless, what you saw in this weekend with Spence and Crawford and in UFC 291 was exactly a classic that you'll never get back. Just like what I said with the CD thing, right? You remember the CDs back in the days? They came with a little pamphlet of some sort and information with credits of the people that were involved, notes of artists, lyrics, or just random pictures that led up to the promotion of the album. Those days you'll never get back. Nowadays, new music comes out, you got to go order it on Apple and Music and whatnot. The new pay-per-view comes out, guess what? You're going to have to go watch it on an app of some sort. And if you're one of these people that used one of these boxes back in the days, guess what? You're going to have to learn and adapt. And that's the reality of today's boxing and combat sports in the metaphorical sense. So I got to tell you, like, as frustrating as boxing can be, especially from an MMA fan's perspective, where you get all the best fights year in and year out, especially if you watch the UFC, right? And also all mixed martial arts altogether basically tries to put on the best fights possible in the most competitive fashion where nobody's protecting anybody. And in boxing, you rarely get that. You constantly get all these tune-up matches, these fights where you know that the other guy is going to win, no 50-50 fights, You know the outcome of the fight because of the skill differentiation between one fighter to another. So guess what? It's not that exciting. It's not that compelling. But if you're a hardcore fan and you're an observer of the sport, or if you even train the sport of boxing, guess what? You're going to be interested in it. But for the rest of the world, that's not a combat sports fan or anything like that. They're just not really going to care unless it's a big fight. Now, in this particular generation, I think we are in an era where these big fights are happening. You had Tank Davis taking on Ryan Garcia, finally putting it all on the line. Now you had Crawford and Spence putting it all on the line. Will Tyson Fury put it all on the line to unify an undisputed championship with none other than um, Alexander Usyk after the Francis Ngannou fight, perhaps. Maybe that's in the works. If not, then obviously we know where Tyson stands in an era where most men were out there putting it all out in the line, and then he becomes one of these guys that has never done it. Everybody.
All right, guys, let me know if you can hear me good. We're about to start the stream. Drop a comment if you can hear me. And don't forget to like and subscribe. So, I want to address a few things before we get into the part two of Tupac and Mayweather, rather, witnessing his murder in 96, or allegedly witnessing that. So, one of the most important things I figured out about the whole entire Tupac case was, take, for example, the shooter of Tupac Shakur, Orlando Anderson, right? I think there's a good parallel that you can take into a combat sports perspective in this concept. For one, you got to take into consideration, right? Um, Orlando Anderson was trying to get to where Tupac was at. He was a guy that was a gang member, but was also an aspiring rapper and an aspiring entrepreneur. And many people even cite the fact that Orlando Anderson, the shooter of Tupac Shakur, the Southside Crip member, looks and resembles Tupac in his younger days when he had hair and when he had that flat top haircut. Basically, a Tupac Shakur that's younger with hair in comparison to the 25-year-old Tupac that suffered alopecia, I believe what it's called, the same thing that Jada Pinkett Smith had, and one of those things that basically tears out your hair. But nonetheless, we see a lot of that in combat sports, don't we? Like, you look at Dustin Poirier before the Conor McGregor fight. Who was he? Look at Khabib before the Conor McGregor fight. Who was he? He was no one that really knew in the mainstream world. But of course, if you're a hardcore fan, of course you're going to know who Dustin Poirier is, or you're going to know who Khabib Nurmagomedov is in 2017. But that's the reality of combat sports in relation to the 90s gangster rap. Here's this guy, Orlando Anderson, who's trying to come up, trying to become somebody. And a lot of people don't even bring this into consideration, right? They don't talk about the fact that he was a guy that was trying to get a rap label going, or was a guy that was aspiring to be an artist, somebody that would rival Death Row Records on a world level stage, right? Very similar to what you see with boxers or MMA fighters around the world, where they see their local rivals in the regional scene, let's say, get signed to the UFC, and then they don't get signed. And then eventually, somewhere down the line, they end up fighting each other because of this ongoing beef that they have going on. Well, that's kind of similar to what you see with, let's say, Muhammad Makayev and Jake Hadley right now, right? Now, obviously, these guys were supposed to fight in the UK regional scene, but Muhammad Makayev's career got catapulted. Jake followed up right after, and here we are. They have this regional rivalry going on that they never settled in the regional scenes, and now they could take it to the world stage. That's basically where Orlando Anderson was trying to take this whole entire fiasco with Tupac Shakur. He was going to use the publicity to somehow catapult him into this world of rap, in this world of gangster rap that was really big in the 90s. Now, you got to think this is very similar to what is going on in today's modern combat sphere, right? And why do I say that? Well, for one, you got to think there's a lot of guys out there that want to come up, and then they see other guys that are already there. And then there's these two different contrasting lives that they're both living, right? One guy is now living in the mansions, meeting with all these celebrities. They have all these resources available to them. In other words, they have more of the means and resources to somehow make themselves a lot more richer in the future. Basically, are resources of investments upon investments. Whereas if you're the guy on the bottom, I mean, you have to start somewhere and you have to hope that whatever it is that you're trying to achieve is going to happen so that you can create more lucrative opportunities for yourself. So that's kind of what this story with Tupac's murder really comes down to, is the haves and the have-nots. And by the way, isn't this really the reality of modern combat sports, if not all of combat sports altogether? Right? Because you got to think, right? What is the most common theme that you hear with people as they come up in the fight game? Well, he's not anybody. He's just a new guy in the scene, right? You're always going to be doubted. You always hear these stories where people talk about how people were doubting them. People were not believing in them. And this is kind of the same thing that what you see with Terrence Crawford, right? Like, you think about this. Let's look back with Terrence Crawford, okay? The guy was in a situation with Top Rank where Top Rank did not want to did not want to fund him any longer. And the reason why they didn't want to do that was just because they felt that he wasn't lucrative enough for their investments. Bob Arum mentioned something to the effect about Terrence Crawford where, man, you know what? I had to basically give up a house, or I could have bought a house, or something to that effect of what Bob Arum said about Terrence Crawford. And then what did he do? He let him go. And then Terrence Crawford became a free agent, in which you see now he ended up fighting in PBC, not exactly signed with the PBC, but the PBC never wanted him in the first place for one reason or another. Now, the bottom line is this is a guy that's continuously being doubted. Okay. So being that, yeah, sorry about that little glitch there, but yeah, the PBC never wanted him in the first place because they didn't think that he was going to be lucrative. A lot of people didn't want Terrence Crawford, even though he was the best guy in the world. Now, the problem with that is that he didn't have the charisma that all these other boxers did, right? Hey, by the way, guess who else didn't have charisma to match with Tupac? It was none other than Orlando Anderson. Now, obviously, we're talking about two different things, but I'm trying to relate to them so that you can understand from a double perspective of what it is that struggling artists go through and what struggling fighters go through in relationship to the fighters and the rappers and entertainers are already on top. And what that is a situation where sometimes you don't want to give the other guy a chance or anything like that, or you just don't think that he's lucrative, or you don't think that there's anything there that's going to be worth your time of investments. The bottom line is that you got to understand with Tupac, right? He had an insane level of charisma, right? And Orlando Anderson didn't have that. So of course you're never going to notice Orlando Anderson. And of course, everybody loves to say that Tupac was this gangster or this and that. Yeah, he was a gangster to a certain extent, but it was almost like I don't want to say that he had a choice or didn't have a choice, but let's just say that it was a lot of things that he could have avoided. Okay, I get it. You're part of the Black Panther family. Your parents were revolutionaries. They were anti-government. That's one thing. I don't think that has anything to do with the Bloods or Crips or their ever-growing conflict that you can date back to the 1970s. I don't think any of that has anything to do with it. But he chose to be part of that circumference because let's just be honest about it, right? Everybody loves to be dangerous. Now, on top of that, not only are you dangerous, you also create some sort of different persona about you. And that's kind of what Tupac Shakur had going on, right? But in the end, you've seen what happened with Orlando Anderson. He's the one that shot Tupac. He's the one that killed Tupac. And unfortunately, he's not the one that is getting the recognition. And then obviously 2 years later, he ends up dying and in a hail of gunfire in the same similar fashion where he was in a conflict with other gang members, and then he shot them, and then he got shot. So then, lo and behold, Orlando Anderson suffered the same fate as Tupac Shakur. But nonetheless, you want to talk about in a combat sports metaphor or simile? Let's really delve into that, right? The hip hop culture does not respect the shooter for one reason or another. Now, I think the reason with that is because obviously this is one of those things where if you shoot someone, then you're going to go to jail. And then even if you brag about it, like what Keefe D, the uncle of Orlando Anderson, did, you're going to go to jail and you can't use it as stats in any kind of way. It's not like knockout stats or submission stats or anything like that. But nonetheless, it didn't help him. And by the way, in combat sports, it doesn't always help other people when they knock out, let's say, your favorite fighter. Like how did it go with Chris Weidman when he knocked out Anderson Silva? Did it give him any more clout than Anderson Silva? No. I heard people say somewhere along the lines with that fight that even though Anderson Silva won, I'm sorry, that even though Chris Weidman won, that Anderson Silva is still the better fighter. And that's in that kind of perspective is where he sort of won, right? But nonetheless, that's the reality of combat sports. That's the reality of gangster rap. They don't respect the shooter. And in combat sports, sometimes they don't respect the winner. Well, with Terrence Crawford, it just seems like he's in this situation now where they have no choice but to really respect him. Right? Why is that? Well, because he did a number on Errol Spence. And of course, there's this other concept where people say that Errol Spence was compromised, he was hurt, he was this and that. But then I also hear other comments where people say, well, what if he fought the likes of Raleigh? What if he fought the likes of Ugas that night, Keith Thurman or Danny Garcia? He would mop the floor with them. It just so happens that Terrence Crawford happens to be the best guy in the world right now. And this is the reality of this situation. Now, can you compare that with Tupac Shakur and Orlando Anderson? My goodness, absolutely you could compare it to that. Because who was the shooter in this particular instance and who was the victim? But yet there are people out there that still look at Errol Spence as somewhat of a hero even after this, especially if you're from Texas. Okay, now you got to think he is a guy that represents Texas, the Dallas Cowboys, whereas in a contrasting side of that, you have Terrence Crawford, who comes from a very athletic town, right? Omaha, Nebraska. Make no mistake about it. This is why Terrence Crawford has a great wrestling background, because it's a great wrestling state. There's a lot of great wrestlers that come out of that, and they have a great wrestling program in their colleges in that part of the world. So therefore, it's not really that far-fetched to really doubt Nebraska, because they didn't, even with all that, they don't have a professional team. They got all the college teams. They got great wrestling program, as I had just mentioned. But guess what? They don't have a professional team like the Dallas Cowboys that back up Errol Spence Jr. By the way, Crawford also didn't have a well-known modern rapper like Yella Beezy to represent him and walk him out in those epic walkouts that Errol Spence has had in his past fights. But guess what? He topped that by basically saying on Instagram, hey, listen, I'd like to have Eminem come out. And then lo and behold, Eminem said, say no more. I'll be right there in Vegas. And by the way, they even mentioned in the Hot 97 interview with Rosenberg, in Terrence Crawford's recent interview with Hot 97, he mentioned something to the effect of where Rosenberg said this, that Eminem doesn't even go outside as much, right? And you got to think these are different levels of celebrities. Eminem is a different level of celebrity than, let's say, Yella Beezy, even though Yella Beezy is known to the hardcore fans of rap in the modern era, right? But Eminem is world famous. He comes from an era where, by the way, CD players were big. So that means you had to go buy these albums in a physical, tangible CD, and you got to bring it home with you. Just like what I mentioned early in the video when I played one of the videos that's out right now on my video section. My final thoughts on Crawford versus Spence, and then the UFC 291 card, and my thoughts on that. So yeah, why did I title it Crawford versus Spence this time when the beginning it was Spence versus Crawford? Well, because guess what? Now Crawford is the A side, and he just took the entire clout of Errol Spence, and he did all that without any trash talking, without any bad mouthing anyone, without any of these crazy antics that you see in the modern world. And by the way, every time somebody mentions all the crazy antics and the trash talk in MMA and boxing, let's be honest, we're talking about one person. There's many names, I'll name all of them, but the one name that really comes to mind is none other than Conor McGregor. Okay, when you think about trash talking or smack talking in MMA or in boxing, who do you think about? Conor McGregor. Of course, there's other names. Obviously, Adrian Broner comes to mind. Raleigh Romero comes to mind. Colby Covington comes to mind. Just a whole bunch of names that's too far to mention. But you get where I'm getting at, and you understand what I mean. But nonetheless, it's really Conor McGregor that we think about in a modern era when it comes to the guys that trash talk. And look what it's done for him. It's done great things for him, but at the same time, it put him in this situation where he now has to constantly fight big and fight beyond what is normal in the settings of his normal fighting style. And what do I mean by that? Sometimes the bigger your fights are, the more that you fight out of your circumference, and the more that you fight out of your linear path. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at Jim Miller, right? Jim Miller is one of the most decorated UFC vets in the many fights that he's had. I think he passed Michael Bisping and Donald Cerrone with the many wins that he's had in the UFC, along with the many fights that he's had in the UFC. And how was he able to accumulate this type of longevity in comparison to, let's say, Conor McGregor, who's probably had way less fights than that in the 10-year span that he's been here in the UFC? Well, the reason why is because Jim Miller is not out there fighting Nate Diaz, Floyd Mayweather, who, by the way, is the big topic of this particular episode. He's not out there fighting Khabib. He's not out there fighting Donald Cerrone. He's not out there fighting Justin Gaethje. I'm sorry, not Justin Gaethje, Dustin Poirier. He's not out there fighting so on and so forth. You get the names that I'm trying to mention. And the magnitude of these events, he's not there. He's fighting low down on the prelims to where he can just fight regular, almost like he's fighting in a gym or in a sparring session. Because guess what? When a Jim Miller fight comes on, especially on a prelims, how many people are in the seats? They're just getting to the seats. There's not too many people there. Or he may fight in an Apex fight night card, or somewhere in a small town like Jacksonville or Nashville or one of these other U.S. markets that the UFC is now trying to get back into after the pandemic days. Because if you remember, before the pandemic in the Apex days, what were a lot of these guys doing? They were fighting in none other than these big cities, even if it was a fight night. And some of these fight nights prior to 2019 felt like a pay-per-view because of the big cities that they would get into. For Sacramento right here was one of them, in the Golden One Arena. And then prior to that, when it was a Sleep Train Arena on the other side of Sacramento, which is Natomas, they had all these UFC fights, and it felt like a big card, even if it was just a regular fight night. So that's the reality of Jim Miller and the likes of Conor McGregor. They're just in a position where they constantly have to hype themselves up, constantly sell the fight. And then on top of that, you're known for being the trash talking guy. So now you got to live up to that. And by the way, guess who had to face all that same similar fashion? None other than Tupac Shakur. So you got to think, why is it that he went after this Orlando Anderson guy? Well, let's be honest, right? You came from a Mike Tyson fight. He knocked somebody out in the first round, very lackluster, and now you're feeling all this energy. By the way, I'm going to tell you guys, if you guys have ever fought or competed, or you've had an entourage with you while you fought and competed, and a lot of these guys who may not be fighters, some of them may be fighters. And by the way, we're going to get to the Jake Paul and Nate Diaz fiasco today in their little press conference. They had a little push and shoving match, And then on top of that, their security, both their securities got into it and got into a brawl. But nonetheless, that's neither here or there. But what we're going to talk about is why did Tupac decide to get into that brawl? It was none other than to impress his death row entourage. Now, the security guys and the Nate Diaz and the Jake Paul fiasco today in a presser, what was all that about? Why did they do it? Well, the reason why they did is because they want to impress everybody in their crowd. And this is what happens when you hang out with a big entourage or when you have a big following or when a lot of people watch you and things of that nature. This is just the reality of what happens. What happens is you fight beyond or act beyond the personality of your median path, meaning who you are on a daily basis. You sort of change up on that. You sort of become a different person because you're around different people. And so that's exactly what Tupac did. He went and humiliated Orlando Anderson in front of everybody. And then lo and behold, what happens? Orlando Anderson comes back and allegedly gets a retaliation on Tupac Shakur, right? And here's the thing. We're talking about just the realm of combat, okay? Let's really keep it in the realm of combat because that's what this is. There's sanctioned combat and then there's combat on the streets. But nonetheless, what people really need to understand is if you have a mindset like Nate Diaz or these other gangster type of guys or these guys that come from honor, Islamic cultures in MMA and boxing, that's what you're going to get is a combat. They see no difference about it. Yes, are they going to be gentlemen about it? Are they going to be nice? Are they going to shake hands? Some will. I'm talking about the Dagestani guys or the Muslim guys that come from an honor culture. Yes, they take it seriously as a war, but they may or may not disrespect their opponent depending on how their opponent comes across them. With Nate Diaz, he mentioned something today to the effect of where, you know what, I'm not really going to trash talk. I'm not really going to go do this back and forth. And his reason why is because he said that this is an incomplete fighting system, boxing. So why am I going to go and try to make a fiasco over something that is not real combat? And that's sort of how he viewed it, which I thought was really fascinating, interesting, and everything all of the above, right? I think that's a really interesting perspective because there are people that actually view that. Look at Conor McGregor after he lost to Floyd Mayweather. What did he say? He said something to the effect of, well, I felt like I lost some football match or something, soccer to that effect, right? It wasn't really a real fight, so he didn't really take it personal as such. So that is the trajectory in which how a lot of people view rules in real combat. So you got to think that in MMA is a sport that is the closest thing to street fighting. Now, you look at what happened with the Orlando Anderson jumping, right? Did that look like a boxing match, even though they were at a boxing event? No. Matter of fact, it looked more like Pride Fighting Championships with the soccer kicks that they were implementing on Orlando Anderson as the brawl was going on. So, with that said, they went and took retaliation to that matter, right? And in any world of combat, in any society, in ancient civilizations, they would look at Orlando Anderson as the winner. The problem is we live in a world of laws and order, and the Constitution protects everyone in terms of having a fair trial, having a fair shake when, let's say, I don't know, when, let's say, the cops are investigating you as a victim and trying to find the perpetrators and this and that. Yes, we live in those types of laws, but nonetheless, in any particular setting, Orlando Anderson would be the winner. Now, the problem is he can't do that, but also the problem is he wants to do that, meaning that he wants to brag about this accomplishment that he did, but he doesn't want to brag about it too much to where it becomes an attention to the law. And that's kind of where this situation with Keefe D is at the current moment of time. Well, why is that? Well, because you got to think, right? Keefe D is not as famous as Suge Knight. He mentions how he went to school and even played football with Suge Knight. And it's crazy how all these gangster dudes that are involved in this situation all know each other and then the different trajectories that they came up on. Obviously, there's a lot of people that will say that Keefe D made millions in the streets selling drugs, whereas you have Suge Knight, who's made hundreds of millions of dollars being the CEO of Death Row Records. Yes, this is all true, but it's sort of like the reality of what we see in combat sports, right? You look at Eddie Alvarez. What is he known as? He's known as the Underground King. Why? Because guess what? He may not be as famous as Conor McGregor, and perhaps maybe he got a little more famous after the Conor McGregor fight, but the fact that he is the Underground King means that he fought around the world, made a ton of money, but is not really that well known. And that's kind of what Keefe D is in that situation. Whereas Suge Knight, he's the guy that's been there, been in the championships, metaphorically speaking, has had all the platinum records, has had all the big money come his way, big paychecks from album A, from album B, from the Doggy Style album to Dr. Dre's debut album, The Chronic, which was an absolute classic. He has had a part in all that, and he's had a part with Vanilla Ice, and you know how that went. And I urge you guys to look at what I mean in that context, because I'm not going to make a whole show about that. Just look up Vanilla Ice and Suge Knight and Death Row Records, and then that'll be that. Okay, but then yeah, these are the two different trajectories that these guys are up on, right? So the problem is, even with all the money that Keefe D has, it will never be as famous as Suge Knight. Okay, now obviously he's not going to have the same amount of money as Suge Knight, but man, if you made millions or whatever, I mean, at a certain point, it really doesn't matter, right? Whether it's 1 million or 100 million. I think when you pass 1 million or 2 million or 3, I just really don't see how you live any different than the next guy, other than just different luxuries that you can buy. One guy can buy a yacht, the other guy can't. The other guy can buy a Ferrari, but yet the small millionaire has a Mercedes Benz. The other guy has 3 houses. Okay, the millionaire has 2 houses. At a certain point, money almost doesn't matter, right? It only matters when you're broke. And the problem is, look, I think Keefe D wanted a little more fame, so he started talking about all this street legend stuff, and people kind of knew and hinted, but then he kind of wanted to poke the bear and sort of say it, and then he had this agreement with the cops where he gives up the shooter of the entire night, and then we don't even know if he's the real shooter, or if it's Orlando, or if he's just saying that it's Orlando because he already got shot. And then at the same time, it's not that far-fetched to believe that Orlando Anderson was the shooter, because he got into a shootout himself in the last moments of his life to defend himself. Well, these are all the realities of all this right now. With all that said, let's talk about Floyd Mayweather's involvement in all this, right? Will he tell? Will he not? And that is the question right here. And should he tell or should he not tell? And if you guys are watching right now or later down the road, I want you to write on the comment section what you think. Do you think that he should tell the police, or he shouldn't tell the police, or it's none of his business, or at some point it really doesn't matter? But nonetheless, he mentions that he's witnessed Tupac get shot. Now, why would he say this knowing that he would get implied by Vegas PD, probably get summoned, probably get asked questions, and then having to force himself to snitch, which would probably be detrimental to his brand in the urban community, which has historically a high mistrust for the police? Well, the reason why is because you got to understand, just like Keefe D, just like anybody out there that has done anything, and just like all these other modern gangsters and modern rappers today that brag about their crimes, you kind of want clout in whatever it is that you're involved in. Now, for Mayweather to be involved in this, you got to think this creates a much, much higher kudos or props to his brand, right? Oh, now you're one of the guys that witnessed Tupac. Oh, but he didn't really think about that thoroughly, because now he's going to have to be asked questions, interrogated, and possibly have to give up information, unless, of course, he switches up his story. And that's the reality of this whole thing, is he could potentially switch up his whole entire story. And yeah, you know, they'll never have to deal with it again. But that's the reality that Floyd Mayweather has going on right now, is that whether he has to tell the police or whether he doesn't have to tell the police, But why did he get himself in this first place? Is because let's just be real about it. He wants the clout. He wants the recognition. And that's literally what Keefe D has done, because guess what? He wasn't a successful record producer like Suge Knight, even though him and Suge Knight went to the same school. And as I mentioned earlier, played in an opposite football team, or I think they played in the same football team, but nonetheless, they were in each other's radar, in each other's tracks, in each other's school grade and class year. That's the reality of this guy, but he just wasn't anybody. And with Orlando Anderson, there were rumors of him saying that he himself had bragged about the shooting of Tupac Shakur in the streets. Now, you got to think, right? This is the 90s back in the day. There was no cameras. Well, in terms of portable camera, I'm talking about like camera phones where it's accessible to you. So recording someone took a little bit of an effort, right? There wasn't any YouTube where people can just make content out of nowhere and talk about, oh, such and such said this or this and that. Everything in the 90s was just almost like a hearsay. So somebody tells you something, maybe you can verify it, maybe you can't. That's just the reality of the situation. You either can verify it or not. And there's really no proof. Sometimes in the 90s, all you had to do was just kind of take it for face value. Oh, yeah, I did such and such. Remember Joe Rogan, where he talks about all these different karate guys that used to go to these underground kumites, and then out of nowhere, they would be dropped off in a forest, and then they would lie to people about saying how they went into this underground tournament or got into these underground fights or kumites or whatever. Well, nowadays, there's a thing called Tapology. There's a thing called Sherdog. There's a thing called BoxRec. So if you want to lie about anything that you have done in combat sports, well, you can just look that up. And there's even amateur records of people online. So there is no hiding. There is no lying. And everything in today's world is right up in your face and can be verified as the truth, or can be verified as a lie, depending on whose subjective opinion and depending on whose objective numbers and metric that you want to go by. But in the 90s, it was like, okay, you know what? You're Orlando Anderson, right? You're living in the hood. You are never going to be as famous as Tupac. You're never going to be as rich as him. Okay, but you're living in this situation where you're in Compton. Even after you killed the guy, you still have to go home and deal with his baby mama drama that he had going on. And by the way, I did a little bit of some extensive research on Orlando Anderson. By the way, a very fascinating story, right? I think that Orlando Anderson should have his own movie, right? They should call it Orlando, the tale of the South Side Crip, right? Or something to that effect, right? Any movie writers out there or directors, please steal my idea. Please go run with it, because I don't even have the budget or resources to make the movie. But if you have this idea, please do an Orlando Anderson movie. Why? For the same reason why Clint Eastwood did a movie about Japanese troops in World War II. Boom! Mind-blowing idea. Mind-blowing idea for Clint Eastwood to do that. Who would have ever thought about doing a movie, a World War II movie at that? And by the way, you're an American director on top of that. And by the way, you're so American that a lot of people think of you as some racist old white man. And then you make a movie about Japanese troops in World War II. Boom! Mind-blowing. Well, why would it be mind-blowing if, let's say, you made a movie about Orlando Anderson? Well, for one, because it is a story of the underdog. Just like everybody in combat sports that you deal with and that you see are underdogs to a certain extent. Now, you look at Terrence Crawford, obviously one of the most dominating fighters of all time in boxing. But you didn't know that in 2018. Sure, you've heard rumblings and people say, yeah, he's this, he's that. But you never really got to understand the value of his skills and his determination, on top of the fact that he is a boxing aficionado and a boxing savant. right? You never knew that about Terrence Crawford. Well, guess what? You never knew that Orlando Anderson was a shooter. And I guarantee you, a lot of people that looked down on him, that said, oh, you ain't never going to be nothing or this and that, you got to think maybe that's kind of what motivated him to go after Tupac Shakur in this kind of way, right? And then on top of the fact that Tupac went and jumped him and beat him up, which creates an even bigger motivation for him to do what he needed to do. But nonetheless, that is why I think you should really do an Orlando Anderson movie, because it highlights what it means to be the guy on the bottom facing all these giants all the way on top. Obviously, I'm not saying this to try to promote any gang violence or anything like that. I'm not here to do that. I'm just simply here to state that I think this is an entertaining concept. And this is one of the reasons why I went and did this particular podcast, because, hey, I'm never going to make a movie about this, but I can talk about it and I can give some sort of insight and metaphor to combat sports and how this relates. For example, I looked at some photos of Orlando Anderson, right? He has multiple kids with this one girl who I believe was a nursing student at the time. And I'm like thinking, man, you know what male out there in California or anywhere in the world can relate to this in his situation that he's at right now? And then I even saw a few photos of him and his family in Disneyland. And I was like thinking, man, you know what? I was in SoCal. I was just down there with my family. So I kind of understand what this is like. It's a very relatable concept with Orlando Anderson, right? And then he is the guy that supposedly has shot Tupac and ended up dying. And then obviously, if you're going to make a movie about it, you imagine that it is a tragic ending in the end, and how he goes about his life. You live by the gun, you die by the gun. And that's sort of the same concept that Tupac lived under. Now, here's the thing, right? A lot of people say that Tupac is gangster, or he's this or he's that. Here's the truth about Tupac, right? I do understand and believe the concept that, yes, maybe he's not the most gangster guy out there, but it doesn't mean that he's not brave. Okay? Because you got to think, and I'm not here to promote any particular violence or anything like that. I'm just here speaking the news. I'm just here telling you exactly as how it happened. Tupac Shakur shot at two undercover cops. And when he did, he went to trial for it and beat it. Okay, this is one of the legends of Tupac Shakur. Now, here's the thing. For him to do that, he was already Tupac Shakur at the time. He was already in the radar of Dan Quayle, the vice president to George Bush Sr. at the time, right? He already made content or rap music that supposedly influenced some Texas guy to shoot at a police officer. And then he just basically became public enemy number one to the federal government and all law enforcement around the country, right? So it was this concept where it was all highlighted. Him getting into this gunfight with the cops and then him beating the trial. Look, with Orlando Anderson, I'm sure he's probably got into gunfights prior to the Tupac incident. I'm sure he's been in drive-bys. I'm sure he's done this and that, but nobody knows about it. Nobody is going to know, especially if you're an aspiring rapper and you want everybody to know what you're all about and you want everybody to understand what you're all about. But nobody knows it until you went after the big fish of the rap game. And that is why I really see a parallel between Orlando Anderson as the underdog coming up versus Tupac Shakur in the same similar fashion that you see in modern combat sports today. Think about this. It's always the same concept from fight 1 to fight 50 or whatever career trajectory you're at. In the first fight, everyone doubts you. Oh, he's good. Okay, he displays some skills, but I don't think he can beat this guy. Okay, then you beat that guy. Well, I don't think he can beat this guy. Then you end up beating that guy. And so on and so forth. Eventually, you become a proven entity. And how is that? You became a proven entity because you were once an unproven entity. And this is the reality of combat sports and the reality of living by the gun and dying by the gun. And I hope you enjoyed this particular content. Like and subscribe. That is all that I have for you. And I will be coming up with more content in the weeks to come. And enjoy the fights. And welcome to the Theater of the Unknown.